The rain comes down in sheets that turn the Okinawan mud into something between soup and cement, and you're pressed against the side of a destroyed farmhouse that smells like cordite and death. It's June 3, 1945, and somewhere across the valley, a Japanese artillery spotter has your entire platoon zeroed in, calling down fire that's been chewing through Marines for the better part of 3 hours. The metallic thunk of incoming rounds has become a rhythm you've learned to predict, and the spaces between explosions feel more dangerous than the blasts themselves because that's when you hear the screaming. Drop your state in the comments below and hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear is a story that 79 years of official silence couldn't quite manage to bury. And witnesses who saw it happen still wake up arguing about the physics of what should have been impossible. Private First Class. Michael Chin shipped out from San Francisco in February of 1945 with the 96th Infantry Division, carrying a rifle, a rosary his grandmother had pressed into his palm at the docks, and absolutely no illusions about what waited for him across the Pacific. The son of immigrants who'd fled the chaos of 1920s China, Chin had grown up in the Richmond district, helping his father repair clocks and watches in a shop so small you could barely turn around without knocking something off a workbench. His father taught him that precision wasn't about force. It was about understanding the relationship between parts so small you needed a jeweler's loupe to see them properly. By the time Chen turned 18, he could field strip a pocket watch blindfolded and reassemble it without a single piece left over, and his hands possessed the kind of steady control that made senior watchmakers twice his age shake their heads in something between admiration and envy. The Army noticed those hands during basic training at Fort Ord when Chen qualified expert marksman on his first attempt at the rifle range, putting rounds through the same hole at 300 yards while recruits around him struggled to hit the target frame. The range instructor, a tobacco-chewing sergeant from Kentucky named Hodges, pulled Chen aside after the qualification and asked him point-blank if he'd been lying about never shooting before the Army. Chen explained about the watches, about learning to see the microscopic relationship between gears and springs, and Hodges just stared at him for a long moment before assigning him to advanced marksmanship training with a notation in his file that used the word uncanny 3 times in 2 sentences. The 96th Infantry Division hit the beaches of Okinawa on April 1, 1945, as part of the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, and within 72 hours, the entire operation had transformed from a textbook landing into a grinding nightmare of attrition warfare that would eventually consume 82 days and produce casualty figures that still make military historians wince. Japanese forces under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima had abandoned the beaches entirely, falling back to a defensive network in the southern highlands that turned every ridge, every cave, every shattered village into a fortress that had to be taken yard by bloody yard. American commanders found themselves facing an enemy that had studied 3 years of island warfare and constructed a defensive system specifically designed to neutralize every advantage the United States possessed in terms of firepower, logistics, and air superiority. Chen's company got hit hard during the assault on Kakazu Ridge in mid-April, losing 40% of its strength in a single afternoon when Japanese artillery caught them in the open during what was supposed to be a routine advance to consolidate positions. The survivors pulled back to a defensive line 300 yards from their objective, and that's where Chen first encountered the reality of combat marksmanship under conditions that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the controlled environment of the rifle range. Targets didn't stand still, presenting clean silhouettes against a contrasting background. They appeared for fractions of a second, fired from positions you couldn't see, and disappeared before you could acquire them through your sights. The fundamental equations of aimed fire collapsed under the chaos of incoming artillery, the screaming wounded, and the simple fact that your hands shook no matter how much your mind insisted they remain steady. But Chen discovered something during those first weeks of combat that separated him from even the other qualified marksmen in his platoon. When everything descended into chaos and rational thought became impossible, his hands remembered the watchmaker's shop and the thousands of hours spent in an environment where the slightest tremor meant failure. Under fire, Chen's breathing slowed instead of accelerated. His vision narrowed to the relationship between crosshairs and target the way it had once narrowed to the relationship between gear teeth and escapement wheels. Sergeant Thomas Fletcher from Georgia, who'd seen combat in the Philippines, told the company commander that Chen could hit targets that other riflemen couldn't even see through the smoke and confusion, and Fletcher recommended him for training with the battalion Scout Sniper Section. The Scout Sniper program on Okinawa existed in a state of improvisation that reflected the desperate tactical situation facing American forces throughout May and early June of 1945. Traditional sniper doctrine emphasized concealment, patience, and the methodical elimination of high-value targets from positions of overwhelming advantage, but the close-quarters nature of the fighting in southern Okinawa made classic sniper tactics nearly impossible to execute. Japanese defensive positions were too numerous, too well concealed, and too heavily supported by overlapping fields of fire to allow snipers the time and space needed for the careful stalking and positioning that training manuals prescribed. What commanders needed instead were marksmen who could deliver precision fire during active engagements, shooting under pressure while friendly forces maneuvered and enemies returned fire with everything from rifles to artillery. Chen received his assignment to the Scout Sniper Section on May 28th, along with a modified Springfield rifle equipped with an 8-power scope that had been pulled from a damaged weapon and remounted with enough improvised shimming to make an armorer weep. The rifle shot approximately 4 inches to the left at 100 yards, which Chen discovered during a hasty zeroing session that consumed exactly 8 rounds before incoming mortar fire forced everyone to take cover. Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski, who ran the sniper section, told Chen that he'd have to learn to compensate for the scope's misalignment because there wasn't time or equipment available to properly fix it, and if Chen couldn't adapt, he'd be sent back to his regular platoon. Chen spent the next 2 days dry-firing the rifle during lulls in the fighting, building a mental map of the relationship between where his crosshairs pointed and where his bullets actually went, treating the misaligned scope like a watch with a broken jewel that required compensation rather than repair. The impossible shot happened on June 3rd during an assault on a Japanese position that intelligence officers had designated Hill 72, though the actual hill had been so thoroughly destroyed by weeks of artillery bombardment that its current elevation probably didn't match whatever pre-war survey had assigned it that number. 2 companies of the 96th Infantry had been pinned down for most of the morning by artillery fire directed from an observation post that nobody could locate despite multiple attempts by reconnaissance patrols and counter-battery fire from American artillery. The Japanese spotter possessed an elevated position with clear sight lines to American staging areas, and his fire direction was so precise that casualties mounted every time forces attempted to move forward. Division intelligence estimated that the observation post had to be within 1,000 yards of the American positions, probably located in one of the cave systems that honeycombed the limestone ridges, but the sheer number of possible locations made methodical searching impossible under fire. Chen's squad leader, Corporal James Morrison from Philadelphia, assembled 8 men for a patrol with orders to locate and eliminate the observation post by any means necessary. The patrol moved out at 0800 hours following a shallow ravine that offered concealment from direct observation, but made them vulnerable to plunging fire if they were spotted. Chen carried his misaligned Springfield and 40 rounds of ammunition, moving in the middle of the patrol formation where his rifle would have clear fields of fire if contact came from either flank. The morning heat had already turned the ravine into an oven that amplified the smell of decomposition from bodies that hadn't been recovered from previous engagements, and every man in the patrol understood that their survival depended on locating the enemy observer before he located them. The terrain of southern Okinawa in early June 1945 presented a landscape that seemed specifically designed to favor defenders over attackers. With limestone ridges carved into maze-like systems of caves, fissures, and overhangs that provided natural fortifications requiring minimal engineering to become nearly impregnable. Japanese forces had spent months preparing these positions, creating firing ports that were invisible from most angles, establishing multiple fallback positions connected by tunnels, and pre-registering artillery fire on every likely avenue of American advance. Against these advantages, American forces possessed superior firepower but faced the fundamental problem that you couldn't destroy what you couldn't see, and the close terrain made the kind of massed artillery bombardments that had proven decisive in European theaters dangerously ineffective when friendly forces operated within a few hundred yards of enemy positions. Morrison's patrol reached a fold in the ridgeline approximately 600 yards from American lines when Chen spotted something that made him signal for the patrol to halt. Through gaps in the morning haze, he'd caught a glimpse of reflected light from somewhere up the ridge slope, a brief flash that lasted less than a second, but suggested glass or polished metal in a location where nothing man-made should exist. The patrol took cover in a cluster of destroyed trees while Chen studied the ridgeline through his scope, searching for the source of the reflection. For 15 minutes, he saw nothing except shattered rock and vegetation, and Morrison was preparing to order the patrol to move when Chen saw it again, a momentary glint from what appeared to be solid rock face approximately 800 yards upslope. The tactical problem facing Chen contained multiple layers of difficulty that would have made the shot challenging under ideal conditions and approached impossibility given the circumstances he actually faced. The target, if it existed, was concealed behind rock that provided complete protection except for a firing port that Chen estimated at less than 18 inches wide. The range exceeded 800 yards, which pushed his rifle and ammunition near the outer limits of effective accuracy even without accounting for the misaligned scope. The shooting position available to Chen offered no solid rest, forcing him to fire from an improvised prone position on loose coral that shifted with every breath. And perhaps most critically, the moment he fired, his muzzle blast would reveal his position to every enemy soldier within half a mile, making a miss potentially fatal for the entire patrol. Chen studied the target area for another 20 minutes. Watching for any additional signs of activity and building a mental picture of the geometry involved. The cave entrance, if that's what he was seeing, sat approximately 15 degrees above his line of sight and was partially obscured by an overhang that would deflect rounds fired at most angles. To reach the interior, a bullet would need to thread through the narrow firing port and continue for an unknown distance through the cave system before potentially encountering targets. The mathematical probability of success approached zero, and Morrison told Chen directly that attempting the shot would compromise the patrol's position for what was likely a wasted round. But Chen had seen that reflection twice now, and his experience with watches had taught him that patterns didn't appear by accident. There was something in that cave that caught light, which meant there was something in that cave that mattered. The physics of what Chen attempted next violated every principle of marksmanship that instructors at Fort Ord had drilled into basic trainees. He compensated for his scope's misalignment by aiming approximately 6 inches to the right of the cave opening, accounting for both the rifle's inherent inaccuracy and the crosswind that had picked up over the past hour. He elevated his point of aim to account for bullet drop at 800 yards, making an educated guess about the trajectory based on his limited experience with the rifle's actual ballistic performance. And then, in a decision that seemed to defy rational calculation, he held his crosshairs not on the visible portion of the cave entrance, but on a point of empty air slightly above and to the left, trusting an intuition he couldn't fully explain about the relationship between where he aimed and where his bullet would actually travel. The shot broke clean at 0847 hours according to Morrison's watch, and for approximately 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the characteristic crump of artillery fire from Japanese positions abruptly ceased, replaced by a silence so profound that Marines 300 yards away later reported noticing it, despite the ambient noise of combat operations. Morrison's patrol remained frozen in position, waiting for return fire that never came, while Chen worked his rifle's bolt and chambered a second round in case the shot had merely wounded its target without neutralizing the threat. But the silence stretched from seconds into minutes, and when American artillery resumed firing test rounds to see if Japanese observers would respond with counter-battery fire, nothing came back except the distant echo of explosions across the valley. Verification of Chen's shot came 3 days later when advancing American forces finally overran the ridge where the Japanese observation post had operated. A Marine combat engineer named Douglas Patterson from Oregon entered the cave system and found the remains of a Japanese artillery spotter still seated at his position overlooking the American lines, killed by a single rifle round that had entered through the firing port, traversed approximately 30 feet through the cave's interior, and struck him through the upper chest with enough remaining energy to penetrate the concrete wall behind him. Patterson's report, submitted to Division Intelligence on June 6, noted that the geometry of the shot appeared impossible given the angle of entry and the distance involved, suggesting that the bullet must have ricocheted off multiple surfaces inside the cave system before striking its target. But an examination of the wound channel showed none of the deformation or fragmentation associated with ricochets, indicating a direct hit that followed a trajectory nobody could adequately explain. Morrison filed his after-action report on June 4, documenting the patrol's activities and Chen's shot with language that carefully avoided speculation about probability or unusual circumstances. The report stated that Private First Class Chen had engaged a suspected enemy position at approximately 800 yards, and that subsequent silence from Japanese artillery suggested the engagement had been successful. Morrison made no mention of the apparently impossible geometry involved, the misaligned scope Chen had been forced to compensate for, or the fact that hitting a target under those conditions represented a level of marksmanship that exceeded anything Morrison had witnessed in 2 years of combat across the Pacific. The report passed through battalion and regimental headquarters without comment. Just another tactical engagement in a campaign that was producing thousands of similar documents every day. But word spread through the 96th Infantry Division with the speed that only soldiers who'd witnessed something inexplicable could generate. Marines who'd been pinned down by the Japanese artillery, who'd watched friends die from fire directed by the observation post Chen had eliminated, sought him out to ask how he'd made the shot. Chen's explanations, when he bothered to offer them, emphasized the watch repair, the steady hands, the hours of practice compensating for equipment that didn't work correctly. But other members of Morrison's patrol, who'd watched Chen study the target for 20 minutes before firing, described something that sounded less like mechanical precision and more like intuition, a sense that Chen had been seeing something about the relationship between bullet, barrel, and target that wasn't fully visible to other observers. The immediate tactical impact of eliminating the Japanese observation post extended far beyond the single casualty Chen had inflicted. Without accurate fire direction from their forward observer, Japanese artillery units lost the ability to deliver precision fire on American staging areas and supply routes. Casualty rates in the 96th Infantry sector dropped by an estimated 40% over the next 72 hours as forces maneuvered with reduced risk of being caught by perfectly timed artillery barrages. The psychological effect proved equally significant as Japanese defensive tactics that had relied on the observers' reports suddenly became reactive rather than predictive, forcing enemy commanders to reposition forces and adjust their approach to defending terrain they'd controlled for weeks. Chen received no medals, no formal recognition, and no assignment to additional sniper duties after the engagement on June 3rd. Division Command, overwhelmed by the scope of operations across southern Okinawa, had neither time nor resources to investigate individual acts of marksmanship regardless of their tactical significance. Chen returned to his regular duties with his platoon, carrying the misaligned Springfield that had somehow delivered an impossible bullet through an impossible trajectory to eliminate a target nobody else could reach. He participated in the final assault on the Oroku Peninsula, survived the grinding advance toward the southern tip of the island, and was preparing for the invasion of mainland Japan when news arrived that atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that Japanese surrender was imminent. The story might have ended there, buried under the weight of a campaign that produced over 48,000 American casualties and disappeared into the massive bureaucracy of post-war demobilization. But Morrison couldn't let it go. The patrol leader who'd watched Chen make the impossible shot spent the next 40 years tracking down everyone who'd been present that day, collecting testimony, requesting documentation from military archives, and slowly assembling a picture of what had happened on Hill 72 that challenged everything he thought he understood about probability and ballistic physics. Morrison's personal files, donated to the University of Pennsylvania's Military History Collection in 1987, contain letters from 12 different witnesses, each describing the shot from their perspective and each emphasizing different aspects of what made the engagement extraordinary. Douglas Patterson, the combat engineer who'd entered the cave 3 days after Chen's shot, provided the most detailed technical analysis. Patterson had studied engineering before the war and possessed the mathematical background to understand ballistic trajectories at a level beyond most combat soldiers. His letter to Morrison, dated March 1972, included hand-drawn diagrams showing the cave's interior layout, the position of the Japanese spotter, and the angle at which Chen's bullet must have entered to achieve the kill. Patterson's calculations indicated that the bullet had followed a path that required threading through an 18-inch opening while compensating for crosswind, traveling more than 30 feet through the cave's interior without striking walls or ceiling, and maintaining sufficient velocity to penetrate the target at the end of its flight. The probability of success, according to Patterson's analysis, approached 1 in 10,000 under controlled conditions and dropped to 1 in 100,000 given the actual circumstances Chen had faced. The engineering analysis caught the attention of military researchers studying historical marksmanship during the 1970s and 1980s, as the Army sought to understand the limits of human performance under combat conditions. Chen was located in 1981, working as a watch repair specialist in Oakland and living alone in a small apartment above his shop. Researchers from the Army Marksmanship Unit traveled to California to interview him, bringing with them Morrison's files and Patterson's calculations. Chen agreed to discuss the shot, but declined requests to demonstrate his abilities or participate in testing, explaining that whatever skill he'd possessed in 1945 had belonged to a younger man facing circumstances he had no desire to recreate. The interview, preserved in Army research archives, reveals a man who seemed uncomfortable with the attention and insisted that the shot had been as much luck as skill, though his descriptions of the aiming process suggested a level of intuitive compensation that went beyond conventional marksmanship techniques. Modern ballistic analysis, using computer modeling and trajectory simulation, has attempted to reproduce the path Chen's bullet followed on June 3, 1945, with results that continue to generate debate among military historians and marksmanship experts. Simulations based on the documented evidence consistently show that the shot required a combination of factors that individually were possible but collectively approached statistical impossibility. The misaligned scope forced Chen to aim at a point offset from his target by margins that would have caused most shooters to miss by feet rather than inches. The crosswind required compensation that exceeded the adjustment range of the rifle's sights, forcing Chen to hold off target by amounts he couldn't have calculated without modern meteorological instruments. And the cave's interior geometry created a pathway so narrow that bullets fired from slightly different angles would have struck rock rather than continuing toward the observation post. Yet witnesses insisted that Chen had fired only once, that the shot had resulted in an immediate cessation of Japanese artillery fire, and that the subsequent investigation had found evidence of a single kill delivered under impossible conditions. Morrison remained adamant until his death in 1993 that he'd watched something that day which transcended conventional explanation, though he carefully avoided language that suggested anything supernatural or mysterious. In his view, Chen had simply possessed a combination of natural ability, intensive early training in precision work, and the kind of combat-sharpened intuition that allowed certain individuals to process information faster than conscious thought could follow. The technological question of how Chen achieved what he achieved remains unresolved despite decades of investigation and analysis. His rifle, lost during post-war weapons turn-in procedures, cannot be examined to determine whether its misalignment actually helped rather than hindered the shot by creating offset that compensated for wind or other environmental factors. The ammunition he'd used, standard military issue from 1944 production, possessed no special characteristics that would explain extraordinary accuracy. And Chen himself, when pressed by researchers, could offer no technical explanation beyond his description of seeing the relationship between components, the same way he'd learned to see the relationship between gears and springs in his father's shop, implying a form of spatial awareness that operated below the level of conscious calculation. The human element proved equally resistant to simple explanation when military psychologists attempted to understand what had allowed Chen to function under stress that incapacitated other soldiers. Standard testing revealed above-average spatial reasoning and hand-eye coordination, but nothing that would predict performance at the extreme edge of human capability. What emerged from interviews with those who'd served alongside Chen was a picture of someone who processed sensory information differently than most people, seeing patterns in chaos and relationships in randomness that weren't immediately visible to others. His platoon sergeant described how Chen could spot Japanese positions by noticing subtle disturbances in vegetation that other soldiers overlooked, suggesting a form of pattern recognition that operated at a level beyond normal perception. The official Army position, established by historians reviewing Morrison's files in 1995, attributed Chen's shot to exceptional marksmanship combined with favorable circumstances and acknowledged that certain combat engagements produced outcomes that fell at the extreme tail of probability distributions. This explanation satisfied requirements for documentation while avoiding speculation about abilities or training that couldn't be verified through available evidence. Veterans who'd witnessed the immediate aftermath, however, continued to describe the shot in terms that emphasized its impossibility, creating a narrative that lived somewhere between documented history and legend passed down through reunion gatherings and memoirs published decades after the war ended. The broader implications of Chen's engagement on Hill 72 influenced military thinking about marksmanship training and the relationship between technical skill and intuitive judgment under combat conditions. Training programs began incorporating stress inoculation and rapid decision-making exercises designed to develop the kind of performance Chen had demonstrated, though measurable improvements proved difficult to quantify. Some researchers argued that Chen's childhood training in watch repair had created neural pathways supporting fine motor control and spatial awareness that couldn't be replicated through conventional military training, suggesting that certain skills required developmental periods that extended years before military service began. Interest in Chen's story experienced resurgence in the early 2000s when military conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan renewed focus on the importance of precision marksmanship in urban and complex terrain. Modern snipers studying historical engagements encountered Morrison's files and Patterson's analysis, recognizing parallels between what Chen had faced on Okinawa and challenges they confronted in Fallujah or Helmand Province. The fundamental problem remained unchanged: how to deliver precision fire under conditions that made precision seem impossible, and how to train marksmen to function at the extreme edge of human capability when lives depended on shots that probability said couldn't be made. Chen died in 2008 at age 82, having spent 63 years as a civilian watch repairman serving customers who had no idea about the shot he'd made as a 19-year-old private on a destroyed Okinawan hillside. His obituary in the Oakland Tribune mentioned his military service in a single paragraph, noting his participation in the Okinawa campaign and his post-war career without reference to the engagement that military historians had been studying for decades. Morrison had died 15 years earlier, taking with him the first-hand memories of watching Chen aim at apparently empty air and deliver a bullet that killed an enemy soldier 30 feet inside solid rock. Patterson passed away in 2004, leaving behind calculations that continued to generate discussion among researchers attempting to understand the ballistic physics involved. The physical evidence has largely disappeared, consumed by time, bureaucratic record destruction, and the simple reality that armies don't preserve every rifle or ammunition lot from conflicts that ended nearly 80 years ago. What remains are the documents Morrison assembled: Patterson's engineering analysis, Chen's brief interview with Army researchers, and the testimony of witnesses who saw something they spent the rest of their lives trying to explain to anyone who'd listen. The cave on Hill 72 remains, though post-war development and decades of weathering have altered the terrain enough that precise reconstruction of sight lines and angles has become impossible. Modern marksmanship instructors teaching at Fort Benning or Quantico occasionally reference the engagement when discussing the limits of human performance and the role of intuition in precision shooting. Chen's shot has become a case study in how training, natural ability, and circumstance can combine to produce outcomes that seem to transcend statistical probability, though instructors carefully avoid suggesting that students should expect to replicate such results. The fundamental lesson, as most see it, is that human capability under extreme stress occasionally produces results that resist easy explanation, and that the relationship between conscious technique and unconscious processing remains imperfectly understood despite decades of research. You can still find veterans of the 96th Infantry Division at reunions that grow smaller each year, and if you ask about the impossible shot, some of them will tell you they heard about it even if they weren't there. The story has become part of the division's oral history, passed down through generations of soldiers who served in subsequent conflicts and carried forward the memory of a watchmaker's son who threaded a bullet through stone to kill an enemy nobody else could reach. Whether that story represents an accurate account of what happened on June 3, 1945, or whether it's become embellished through decades of retelling, the witnesses who were actually present maintain that what they saw that day challenged their understanding of what was possible. Morrison's last letter to Patterson, written 3 months before Morrison's death, ended with a question that neither man lived long enough to answer. Was Chen just extraordinarily lucky? Or did he see something about that shot that the rest of us couldn't? I've spent 48 years trying to figure it out, and I'm no closer to understanding than I was when his rifle cracked and everything went silent. That silence spread across an Okinawan valley on a June morning in 1945, marking the moment when an impossible bullet found an invisible target, and witnesses started arguing about physics, probability, and the outer limits of human capability in ways that continue to this day. What do you think really happened when a 19-year-old private with a misaligned scope threaded a bullet through 18 inches of rock to hit a target nobody else could see? And whether the truth matters less than the fact that 79 years later, witnesses still refuse to let the story die.